forward to read chapter 4, which has the title Free People, the Origin of Cultures and the Advent of Private Property, which are pretty big ideas. And then they add in parenthesis, not necessarily in that order, is even worse because it means they're going to scatter these things all around and it's up to us to put them together. I have to say I had a little trouble reading through this chapter, composing this, trying to figure out where things belonged, because they seem to be a little bit all over the map. Big questions and not even answering them in the order that we have. So there's some things here that are going to curve back toward things that we've seen before. There's some things here that are going to foreshadow things we'll see later on. Try and bring out the main points, I think, with some asides. Try to put this into an order. I think since we're excited to learn today that there's some big questions that we're going to definitely answer all these questions today, such as what does it mean to be equal or egalitarian? What does it mean to be free? Do whatever I want, free. And of course, what does it mean to be rich? Or we might use the word wealthy, or an even bigger word, affluent. Affluent. It's all kind of synonymous. They all mean slightly different things. Obviously, rich can be used in other senses as well. So those are some of the big questions we'll be tossing around, especially in this first part of the chapter. In the second part of the chapter, which we'll read for Tuesday, they'll be concentrating much more on some ethnographic and archaeological examples. So those might be good things to think about as you're thinking about what you want to write about for your first paper, because those are more, I guess I would say they seem more concrete, something you can dig into a little bit more. These are some kind of big abstractions. The first thing they start off with is talking to us about the importance of the ethnographic record. The ethnographic record, we sometimes talk in anthropology about the archaeological record or the fossil record. We talk about that in evolution as well, which is basically all the stuff that has been left behind or we are able to catalog, dig up, and interpret. The ethnographic record refers to the things that cultural anthropologists did as they went about looking at these different cultures and societies. That they did their ethnography, forming what is called the ethnographic record. Now, they first cautioned us that what it should not be used is some people tried to go into the ethnographic record, look at other societies and say, aha, I've found the society that is the example of what humans were like a long, long time ago in their formation. And we've already examined the dangers of doing that. Let us say if you're Napoleon Chagnon among the Yanomami, or even Richard Lee among the Kalahari. We can look at these societies for examples of what things might have been like, but we don't want to see them as set in stone. The people that we are engaged with are purely as modern as we are. But what they say is that we can get from the ethnographic record and we can use it to interpret the archaeological finds, is that it would have been impossible to imagine what things might have been like from just the material evidence. When all you have is a burial or a pottery sherd or something that you've dug up or a bone, it's hard to imagine what people might have been thinking about that. And so again, we don't want to say that this is exactly what people were thinking, but at least opens the horizons of our imagination. It would have been impossible just from the burials to conclude that maybe people saw anomalous individuals as prophets, like the Nuer sometimes do. Or among the Kwakiutl, the police sometimes double as clowns, and they're police for a season and have very police-like powers, but then that power goes away. Hard to imagine that without somebody describing it. Or there's one, we didn't talk about this much, the seasonal wife-swapping orgies of the Inuit. Probably was too early in the morning to talk about that one. But, you know, the idea is that during different seasons of the year, even the bonds of marriage could be thrown topsy-turvy. Now, they say that, you know, on page 121, even if someone did manage to come up with anything like Nuer prophets, Kwakiutl clown police, or Inuit seasonal wife-swapping orgies, simply through logical extrapolation, they'd probably be instantly written off as kooks. That is to say that the evidence that we have from archaeology doesn't lead to these ideas in our imagination. And even if anyone proposed this as an idea, they'd be like, nah, that's impossible. But that's the benefit of having cultural anthropologists who went around and got these crazy stories and crazy ideas from different societies. So we can at least put this into our imagination. And it turns out people are more interesting sometimes than we think they are, especially compared to our dull life. Actually, that's the next section, is how dull our lives are, which is to say that they then go into this section, and I guess that's where they're talking about the origin of what we call cultures, to say that in some ways the cultures, the little groups of people that all have their own little customs in a little area, like the different tribes of Papua New Guinea, which are all compressed into one area, are actually relatively recent in the sense that they've come about maybe in the last 10,000, maybe even 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And the reason they're saying that, they make the kind of what they say is a counterintuitive claim that our lives are actually smaller today than they were in the past. And the reason is that as a proportion of the population, as population has grown, there are actually fewer people as a proportion who leave their families, who travel long distances. That in the olden days, and when I talk about the olden days, we're talking about 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, a large proportion of people would be seasonally migrating or going into the Americas, traveling thousands of miles, and that would be your whole group might have a somewhat nomadic existence, and you would be shifting from group to group. And today obviously there are people who do this, but as a proportion, as a percentage, it's actually less than it was in the past. And so they say that, this is on page 123, they say, you know, it's easier to move around, but at the same time, increases in the sheer number of human beings seem to have pulled in the opposite direction, ensuring that for much of human history, ever diminishing proportions of people actually traveled, at least over long distances or very far from home. If we survey what happens over time, the scale on which social relations operate doesn't get bigger and bigger, it actually gets smaller and smaller. So what they're saying is that the importance of the ethnographic record, but we should again remember that that doesn't mean that's what it was like in the past. These smaller cultural, maybe what we might call contained cultural units over small territories were not what people were doing in the Ice Age and into the Holocene. So to kind of prove that point, they talk about hunter and gatherer groups that are remarkably cosmopolitan, in the sense that if you look at them, they are composed not just of close kin, but of people from all over the place. And they say that's because that over thousands of miles, even if people didn't speak the same languages, you would see the same kind of religious systems, the same kind of clan organization, so that you could traverse an area of thousands of miles in the Americas, in North America, or in Australia, And you may not speak the language of the group you're going into, but you would identify with a certain clan, and those people would have obligations to give you food and hospitality while you were with them. And they say that this is true even of today's hunters and gatherers, of people who have studied people in the Kalahari, have remarked upon how they have often traveled, continue to travel, and form their groups and reform their groups over long distances, and the groups are not necessarily consistent, which is to say that although we often refer to hunter-gatherers as bands and even as kin-ordered bands, the importance of kinship, we often think they're just kind of an extended version of a family, that in fact, the social life of the hunter-gatherers was much more than simply close kin. And if you look at the ethnographic evidence, people are often moving in and out of groups. People talk about the importance of friendships, being friends, of having friends, and going between different groups because of things like friendship. So this is a pretty interesting and rather huge claim about this Ice Age period, that people had these large-scale social networks. They say that actually the cultures, the things that we know of as sort of these defined, more intimate cultures and smaller scale societies, came about later on as a result of new ways to prepare food and to store food. And so people in different areas, as different areas became populated and more settled, people developed different instruments to store and prepare the food that was in the area, leading to different kinds of what we would call cuisine, so that you would wake up to the same kind of meal every morning. And as we know, food is a way of expressing difference and thinking about yourself in a different way. So they say on page 124, and I think it's quite true, people who wake up to fish stews every morning tend to see themselves as a different sort of people from those who breakfast on a porridge of berries and wild oats. Anybody do a fish stew this morning? I guess not. No, look at that face, that face that Felicia made. It's like it turns, it's like physically repulsive, right? And so we get to this point in our food where somebody offers us a fish stew in the morning and we don't even want to touch it. It's like yucky, goes against our identity. Whereas people are like, yum, yay, fish stew, yum. Such distinctions were no doubt echoed by parallel developments that are much more difficult to reconstruct. Different tastes in clothing, dancing, drugs, hairstyles, courtship rituals, different forms of kinship organization, and styles of formal rhetoric, ways of talking to each other, doing different drugs, different food, different clothes. All those things start to make these worlds. They say that it makes their social worlds, the social worlds are growing more parochial. That is, they're more contained. They're more in these sort of little villages where I only talk to my fellow people who eat fish stews. And if you don't eat fish stew in the morning, you're not worth talking to because you haven't gotten your proper breakfast yet. Now, they say that this is still in the Ice Age and the immediate aftermath. These cultural areas are still huge in comparison today. They're still over maybe hundreds of miles, maybe not thousands of miles, but they're still large. And they say that for the kind of freedom and seasonality, the ability to trade between different modes of subsistence, from going from hunting and gathering to farming and back again by the season, going from an authoritarian police society in one season to a carefree band in the summertime or in the wintertime, you need this cultural porosity. You need to have the ability to go back and forth, the ability to leave a place if somebody's getting too too crazy and, you know, trying to enforce their will upon you. You have to be able to transfer right out of that college whenever things get too authoritarian. Got to switch out. So again, they're not saying that they're not saying that the cultural porosity, these cultures entirely limited it during this period, but it is starting to take shape, these different cuisines, different cultures during the period immediately after the Ice Age, what we'll be studying in the Holocene. So they then, of course, turn to one of their huge questions. What does it mean to be equal? Or what does it mean to be egalitarian? So they say that in the ethnographic record, in the anthropological literature, we talk about various forms of inequality and hierarchical societies in some of these places that develop these cultural areas, even if we may not have been as attentive as we were in the past to the seasonality of those arrangements. But we also use this term egalitarian societies, often to refer to the hunter and gatherer existence, or for the most part. And so what they ask is, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to be equal? Does it mean everyone has the opportunity the same? Does it mean that everyone is truly equal and in that way boring? Or does it mean that everyone has the same opportunities, although that might result in difference over time? So what they say is that, for one thing, in an egalitarian society, you would have to have some ideal of equality, right? Some idea within that society of what should be in place, that's an ideal that you have, and that people had basically been able to make it take place, to pull it off. And so you'd have to have this ideal of equality and then realize. Now, the interesting thing is that if in different societies, you might have different values that you wish to equalize. So maybe in some societies, their primary value is everyone is equal before the law. But it doesn't matter if somebody has more stuff than another person, because as long as you're equal before the law, as long as you have the same opportunity, it doesn't matter. Or they say, well, maybe in some societies, the whole ideal of equality is equality before the gods, religious equality. You can attain this thing. So it doesn't matter if some people are lording it over others in the material realm, as long as everyone is equal before the gods. But there is a problem here, which is that how do you measure this objectively, right? Are you really going to believe? If somebody tells you, oh yes, we're all equal here before gods, and you go in and some people are enslaved to other people, even if they say they're all equal, you're kind of like, wait a second, what's going on? And so the problem becomes is, how do we objectively measure this? And as they say, ever since Rousseau and Adam Smith, the objective measure of equality in society, what we try to figure out if people are equal or not, is how much stuff people have, how much property they own. And the reason we say that hunter-gatherers are egalitarian or equal is because they can't accumulate stuff. You aren't able to own things, and if you're constantly or relatively constantly on the move, you're not going to have material surplus. You can't store things over time and lord it over people because you have more stuff than them. So they take a brief aside here to just go and say, well, then, does it mean we should blame farming for the rise of the hierarchical state, the rise of inequality, the rise of all those things? Now, they're going to talk about this much more as we go on. So this is basically just a brief aside to say, no, we shouldn't, in part because they say the first farmers emerge about 6,000 years before there's any state emergence, there's any what we would recognize as a state government, and that some farmers never actually create states at all. So again, they're going to be talking about this later on, but just as an aside, they say we shouldn't just say that as soon as farming was developed, as soon as people could accumulate material surplus, that automatically became a development of a hierarchical state society. So that's their answer to that. So they then go back into the hunter-gatherers and say, you know, examining the work of James Woodburn, who was a huge authority on truly egalitarian hunter and gatherer societies. And so he worked among the Hadza, other groups, and basically claimed or came up with the idea that these were genuinely egalitarian societies, and they were egalitarian or equal, not just in terms of the relationships of what we might call classes or social classes among the groups, but they were also relatively equal in terms of gender relationships as well. And so Woodburn's idea is that the only real way to have equality among people is if you don't have any material surplus at all. And so Woodburn distinguishes between two different kinds of hunter and gatherer societies: immediate return and delayed return. And in the immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, those are the ones you just go out, you gather your berries, or you do your hunt, you bring the stuff back, and you eat it that day. Don't store anything, you know, maybe for one day, but it's really fast. Whereas he said that there were other societies in which you'd hunt, perhaps in the Arctic societies, for example, you'd do a hunt and then there'd be these elaborate food storage techniques where you'd be able to keep the stuff over time. And so it wouldn't be a day-by-day kind of thing. And so, according to Woodburn, in these delayed return hunter-gatherer societies, there are these hierarchies and inequalities that develop. And it's really in the immediate return. And some of those, especially African forager groups, the Hadza, among the Kung of the Kalahari, that you'd get this genuine, true equality, as I said, not just between the groups in a society, but between genders as well. And so for Woodburn, any equality worth the name is essentially impossible for all but the very simplest foragers. And of course, that would mean, as they said, that would mean that we're in a pretty bad place, because we're not going to be able to have an immediate return hunting and gathering society. That is just not on the table. They do say that, you know, maybe if we could get those replicators from Star Trek where you can ask for a cheeseburger and it produces one, and that's all you need to do to get your food, then we can go back to being equal. But until then, I'm kind of stuck in this situation, according to Woodburn. Now, of course, they don't want us to be stuck here because that's too pessimistic, and it doesn't talk to us about the variety of social arrangements that people have had and been relatively more free and autonomous than we seem to be today. So they say, okay, the equality argument, if you remember, they say, you know, that was something that came up later in the Americas. When you go back to Kandiaronk, the original argument was about being free and having freedom and autonomy, being able to do things. And here they distinguish between formal freedoms and substantive freedoms. Gabe, what are formal freedoms?
if you want to like travel, you need a passport, you need like your ID, driver's license, and that like requires other things that you also need, that also require other things that you need to do. Kind of don't really have the freedom to travel.
So I'm formally free. I can go wherever I want, anytime I want to. Free. Walk out of here right now. But, yeah, you're free. You're obviously free, Cyrus. You don't have to do anything. Or do you? So they talk about the difference between formal freedoms, the idea that you can do all these things, and actually being able to do them, substantive freedoms. Like, okay, did you get all that stuff, and are you on the road right now? As we can tell, Cyrus almost walked out of class, but he didn't. He didn't take advantage of his substantive freedom. He kept it in the formal sense. He gave up his freedom in order to learn because he's excited to learn. So that's what happens. It's very interesting to me when I typed in the word freedoms into PowerPoint, immediately the Statue of Liberty popped up as, aha, that's what you must mean, freedoms. Ha, ha, ha. Yes. And I, as a US citizen, I can go wherever and whenever I want to go. Yes, no. I mean, as Gabe put it, or as they put it, American citizens have the right to travel wherever they like, provided, of course, they have the money for transport and accommodation. They are free from ever having to obey the arbitrary orders of superiors. Go ahead, you're free, Cyrus. You don't have to obey the orders of superiors. Who's making you sit here? Unless, of course, they have to get a job. And actually, I was interested in this because it's like, okay, I can go wherever I want and whenever I want, but I need the money to do it. Well, how do I get the money? Oh, I got to get a job. Oh, shoot, now I'm working for somebody. Not only that, in order to get the money to travel, I have to have a job, and I can't travel because I'm working this stupid job, like in this terrible situation. I do not have substantive freedoms. Let's see. What they were concerned with, what egalitarians people were not so much formal freedoms as substantive ones. They were less interested in the right to travel than in the possibility of actually doing so. Right? So having this abstract right to travel, we have many freedoms in the abstract, but can I actually do it?